Welcome to the final session of the day. On behalf of GLF Colorado, Festival co-directors Namita Gokhale and William Dalrymple, Festival producer Sanjoy K. Roy, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, Boulder Public Library, and the City of Boulder, we welcome you to this session of GLF Colorado 2021 Virtual Festival. Whitehorse and Moon of the Crusted Snow, Waubgeshig Rice, and Erika T. Wurth in conversation with Maeve Conran. Author, journalist, and Wasauksing First Nation member, Waubgeshig Rice's novel, Moon of the Crusted Snow, is a post-apocalyptic churning of action, allegory, and human resilience. Masterfully blending together the Anishinaabe language into dialogue with an ode to the natural world, the narrative observes the structural collapse of the community cut off and led to fend off for itself. The tale follows their journey as they turn to their Anishinaabe tradition and culture in hopes of reviving their land, people, and sense of self. An Apache, Chickasaw, and Cherokee, Erika T. Wurth is the author of an upcoming literary horror speculative novel, Whitehorse, published by Flatiron, Macmillan. Together, in conversation with Maeve Conran, Rice and Wurth examine the complexities of the Indigenous experience and explore the many nuances of hope, desire, and identity. Waubgeshig Rice's participation is sponsored by the Consul General of Canada in Denver. Waubgeshig Rice is an author and journalist originally from Wasauksing First Nation. His first short story collection, Midnight Sweat Lodge, was inspired by his experiences growing up in an Anishinaabe community and won an Independent Publishers Award in 2012. His debut novel, Legacy, followed in 2014. In the same year, he received the Anishinaabe Nation's Deb V. Wynne Citation for Excellence in First Nation Storytelling. Erika T. Wurth's literary horror speculative novel, Whitehorse, is forthcoming with Flatiron Macmillan. She teaches creative writing at Western Illinois University and has been a guest writer at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Her work has appeared or is forthcoming in numerous journals, including Buzzfeed, Boulevard, LitHub, The Writer's Chronicle, and The Kenyon Review. She will be faculty at Breadloaf in 2022, is a Kenyon Review Writers Workshop scholar, attended the Tin House Summer Workshop, and is a narrative artist for the Meow Wolf Denver installation. She is represented by Rebecca Friedman. She is of Apache, Chickasaw, and Cherokee descent and was raised outside of Denver. Maeve Conran is an award-winning broadcaster whose news stories have been broadcast on Radio France, RTE, Ireland's national broadcaster, as well as NPR and many radio stations in the United States. She is the co-host of the monthly Radio Book Club and the podcast After Hours at the Radio Book Club, a collaboration between KGNU Radio and the Boulder Bookstore. She is currently the program director at Free Speech TV. Do follow our social media handles to get notified on the upcoming sessions. In these difficult times, we have struggled to bring you GLF Colorado without charging a registration fee. Please support as generously as you can to ensure a free, seamless, and continuous flow of knowledge. You can support us through the Support GLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Before we start the session, may I please invite Mr. Stephen Green, Consul and Program Manager of Foreign Policy and Diplomacy Service from the Office of Consulate General of Canada in Denver, to say a few words.
Hello et bonjour. My name is Stephen Green and I'm the Consul for Political, Economic and Public Affairs at the Consulate General of Canada in Denver. The Consulate is excited to once again partner with the Jaipur Literary Festival to support the participation of 3 incredible Canadian artists at the festival this year, Waubgeshig Rice, Madhur Anand, and Samir Zafar. The Government of Canada is a proud supporter of the arts, particularly stories created and told by diverse voices that have the power to open our eyes to new ideas and perspectives that broaden how we understand and live in this world. Why? Because art is activism. Stories have the power to capture our thoughts, our emotions, and help us better understand and relate to one another. And I'm excited to introduce one of the Canadian artists with us at this year's festival. Waubgeshig Rice is an author, journalist, and member of the Wasauksing First Nation. He began his career in news media, where he was a video journalist and host for CBC Radio afternoon show Up North. He has written 3 fiction novels, including the 2018 bestseller Moon of the Crusted Snow, a post-apocalyptic tale of an Anishinaabe community trying to survive amid social collapse. The sequel to the novel, set in the same community 10 years later, is expected to be published in 2022. I thank each of you, the audience, for joining us for Jaipur and these important author conversations. Enjoy the festival.
Thank you, Mr. Green, and the entire Office of Consul General of Canada in Denver for their support towards the festival. Much appreciated. Ladies and gentlemen, Whitehorse and Moon of the Crusted Snow, Waubgeshig Rice and Erika T. Wurth in conversation with Maeve Conran. Maeve, over to you.
Erika and Wob, it is so great to have you here to talk about your incredible books. Erika, you have written fiction, non-fiction, poetry. We're excited to talk about your upcoming book, Whitehorse, and Wob, we're really excited to talk about your most recent book. But to frame this entire conversation, I'd love to hear both your thoughts on the need and the role of writing about Indigenous issues, First Nation people, Native Americans, in a contemporary setting, and this idea of Indigenous futurism. I think, Erika, I've heard you use that phrase, or other folks use that phrase, and why we need to have those stories set in a contemporary setting, but also look to the future as well. Erika, maybe we start with you.
Sure, and thanks for asking such a great question. I think the thing is, like, why it's kind of sad that that has to even be framed that way, right? Like, no one would even ask a white author, or I'm not even sure anyone from any demographic, like, why is it important that you're writing stories about now? You know what I mean? And I think this is why I love Wob's book so much, and why I love speculative literature, and why I love the whole concept of Indigenous futurism, which is, which was sort of set by this woman named Grace Dillon, who's of Anishinaabe descent. And she's, kind of taken inspiration from Afrofuturism, which she'll tell you. And I think it matters so much because, yes, it matters for outside populations to understand that we exist now, we exist in extreme diversity, and we plan on existing in the future in our own way, with our languages, with our land, or even in space, if that's what we so choose, right? Yeah, I guess that's all I have to say. Wob, please take it.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Erika. And I would say that overall, society has failed both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people by not portraying our current realities, by not allowing us to exist as we are, and allowing us the opportunity to convey our truths, our real day-to-day experiences. So I agree with you. Yeah, the framing of the question is definitely weird, but it is something that has to essentially happen to get those conversations going, right? And for me, I see fiction as an opportunity to really contextualize things in a much deeper way. I used to work daily as a journalist, but when you're covering some of those important issues, you can really only scratch the surface in the time that mainstream media allots you, right? And it's strange to say that working with fiction, I think, can get to the truth in a more comprehensive and a more meaningful way, because you have that space to offer that context. And as you mentioned, that allows us to be ourselves in a contemporary sense. It's our sort of arrival in sort of the contemporary world, right? By allowing us to speak our truths in these various formats. So, and that applies to not just literature, but film, to stage, to visual arts, and so on, right? And it's just really cool to see all these happening, finally, overdue.
And it does seem that we need more representation. It is there. It's just not, I think, being acknowledged, of Indigenous writers across all genres of literature. horror, for example. I'm a huge fan of Stephen Graham Jones and his slasher novels that are written through an Indigenous lens. Of course, Erika, your upcoming book, I think you call it an elevated ghost story. So tell us what your thoughts are on about having those Indigenous voices and stories being told, not just in a contemporary setting, but across all types of literature.
I think, sorry, and just talking to Wob is making all the scenes in his novel like come to life in my head. So it's hard for me to get that out. But yeah, that's because I think there are a number of contemporary Native American writers who are finally getting some attention, like not just, yes, with bigger presses or bigger independent presses or just with larger audiences, but now we have the opportunity, and possibly social media, as messy as it is, to see each other. And there's something so important about that, because it's, I think, one of the things that I value in Native art is not making it into this authenticity project of, let me show white people that I'm the only Indian who's the most authentic one, and look at every single way in which my book is so authentic, which is kind of hilarious, because I always think about, like, if you gave that book to your sister or your cousin, would they find it so? And I'm guessing not. But that's what's going on. And I love watching this brilliant rainbow of writers from every genre. My partner, David Heskell-Wandley-White in crime, Stephen Graham Jones, just this wonderful comic book nerd of a guy with his like New York Times bestselling novel. Sherry Dimeline, right? She's in Canada. She's made huge inroads here. Rebecca Roanhorse. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And I love the way it's sparking real, I think, this is sort of cheesy sounding, but like spiritual health with like younger Native people and younger Native writers. Like, hey, what I am is okay. And I also can make stuff up, and I can have fun with it, and I can be respected intellectually and creatively for it.
I love that. And I love that you mentioned sparking that joy and interest in younger writers. I know, as a teacher, Eric, that's huge. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe also I'd like both of you to share, what were your inspiration? What Native writers inspired you when you were younger and reading and absorbing, literature before you became writers yourself?
Yeah, just to pick up on Erika's point, there is like a vast spectrum of storytelling that we see worldwide from Indigenous communities, right? And it's interesting, she brought up Cherie. I interviewed both her and Eden Robinson last year for the Globe and Mail here in Canada. And the focus of the discussion was genre, why are Indigenous authors succeeding in various genres, from horror to sci-fi to fantasy and so on? And the conclusion that conversation came to was that genre is sort of a byproduct of the stories that we do. We're first and foremost telling the stories of our people and our community, and then we leave it up to the publishers and the critics to sort of silo them into these genres because they have to be marketed and sold that way, right? But the beauty of Indigenous storytelling more broadly, not to get too general about it, is that there is such an array of different kinds of stories that really we just convey them as best we can through our own lived experiences and from the lessons we've heard from our elders and so on, and they'll just naturally end up in one of those genres, right? So to answer your second question there, Maeve, the writers that inspired me very much were the ones who are out there speaking our real experiences. And I say that in a more international way, not just the Anishinaabe authors that I know of, but, people like Thomas King, Lee Maracle, Louise Erdrich, Richard Wagermes, back in the 1990s when I was a teenager, who really showed me that our experiences existed in a literary form. And also our stories were valid enough to be printed that way. Because when you're that age in a high school setting off the reserve, the printed book is held up as the pinnacle of storytelling, right? And if you don't see yourself reflected in that, you're not going to feel like your experiences or your stories are valid enough. But those people did that for me and continue to inspire me today.
Well, I'd love to talk about some of the themes that go across all Indigenous storytelling, it seems, and regardless of whether it's set in gangs in Albuquerque, Erika, you're writing about those, or a modern ghost story, or almost futuristic look at what happens in a post-apocalyptic world in the Northern Territories, Wob. But this loss of identity, the colonialism, the white settler mentality that is still it's pervasive. It's not just history, it's living history. It's happening ongoing, and these themes are reflected so much in all of these writers that you've mentioned there. So what, you know, in your book, Moon of the Crusted Snow, I guess it could be set right now. There were so many parallels. I know you wrote this just prior to COVID, but when I was reading that scene of the not the looting, but people frantically stocking up at the store of the canned goods because, you know, power has gone out. So just, you know, it's set in this time where electricity's gone out, digital media's gone out, the cell phone coverage has gone out. And so you have this reservation in northern Canada that's isolated. We find out that the entire world, it seems, has gone down. But there's these themes that you explore about loss of identity and how the traditional Indigenous practices were the ones that helped people survive. And when I was reading that, albeit you wrote it prior to COVID, there were so many parallels to what we're going through now. So for folks who aren't familiar with your book, maybe take us through the premise of it and why these were themes you wanted to explore.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. And thanks a lot for the opportunity and for reading it. Moon of the Crusted Snow essentially is a post-apocalyptic story told from the perspective of a Northern Ontario First Nation that endures a world-ending blackout. So while that immediate shock isn't too intense because the community knows how to live on the land, how to acquire food and medicine from the land around them, as it prolongs, things get a little uneasy, and then that's compounded by unexpected visitors from cities to the south who seek to impose their will, and then again, I guess, further colonize this far northern community, right? So it was inspired by a major blackout that happened in North America back in 2003. And I was in my home community at the time, and my brothers and I really started to make a plan of, you know, coming together with our community and figuring out a way to, you know, cope with this event if it was like a big catastrophe, you know? And, you know, I thought about a lot of the post-apocalyptic fiction I'd read up until that point in my life, and there wasn't a lot of conversation in those books around community building or figuring out how to create a healthy future for everybody who survived, right? It's usually just like one or two people trying to survive, you know? But I experienced something very different in that blackout in my community, and I really wanted to convey that somehow in literature. And I didn't start writing it till many years after, but, you know, those themes and those elements are always there, you know? I think these societies and these infrastructures that we're reliant upon are very fragile to begin with, and this could happen anytime. And we saw that panic happen a year and a half ago, as you mentioned, as the pandemic started. So it'll probably happen again too. So.
Well, yesterday with the Facebook and Instagram down for several hours, people were like, oh my gosh, how could we be connected? You know, what's going to happen if it goes down for many years? But you really contrast the difference in approach to when this happens with the First Nation community and their sense of community. How do we look after those who can't look after themselves? How do we share what we've hunted? And that happened even prior to, you know, the blackout. And then you have these two young men who are in college, you know, further south, and they come back and they're terrified because they've seen what's happened, riots, people killing each other on the streets. And it's such a contrast with how the First Nation community deals with this. And I mean, you could look at how, you know, that contrast exists in so many places, from environmentalism, the difference between a concept of stewardship as opposed to exploitation and extraction of the land. You know, when we look at what's happening with nature, I thought you really outlined that so well in the book.
Oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate that. And yeah, the book, you know, was very much inspired by the relationship that I and my community have with the land around us. You know, I grew up in the bush, learning how to do a lot of, you know, medicine gathering and food harvesting and so on. And I've lost a lot of that by having moved to the city when I was 19, right? And I'm 42 now, and I think it's like a long road back to try to get to that place, you know? And part of writing the story was a bit of self-motivation, you know, to remind myself that I may need to brush up on some of those things, especially in light of the recent pandemic.
Well, there's a character in the book that I think is so crucial. And actually, she reminded me of some characters you've written about, Erika, the elder woman who has wisdom. And Aileen, I think her name is in your book, Wob, and she She says when people say, oh my God, it's the apocalypse, she says, we've already had the apocalypse when we were colonized and they stripped us of our language and our culture. And I thought that was just such an incredible way to put it. And then she said, we're already living in a post-apocalypse. You know, I mean, Erika, you often write about, you know, the loss of culture, loss of identity. So many of your books are in an urban setting. And I think when we get back to talking about the need to have contemporary or futuristic settings when we're writing about Indigenous stories, we often, society, I think, doesn't think about Native Americans, Indigenous people in urban settings. And you really explore that in your writing.
Well, my family has been urban for generations. Some of them are from Mexico and some of them from the Southeast, and they sort of like ended up in Texas. And then my dad was a super white guy. Well, what I find kind of hilarious about American literature is that it's so hilariously astonished by that. Whereas in Canada, people are like, like there's people like Katharina Vermette who's just like the master of urban Indian literature, but never at any point in time, and I have this whole article about this, were people like, wow, holy shit, do you know that Indians live in cities? Wow. And yet Tommy Orange built so much of his career around that. It's weird. And I have to say, my family is extremely urban, but I grew up with enough people from the res that's what was a little bit hilarious about Waub's novel, is that of course Waub is like a master of like creating tension and getting these people in there that are going to up the ante like so wonderfully. So you're like, oh my God, like what is that white guy going to do? Right. And then there's the moment where I don't want to ruin it. But so anyway, but at the same time, it's so res because parts of their lives don't change at all. Whereas like in the city, as you pointed out, they're writing, but everyone's like, oh shit, I guess we got to do some other stuff now. You know, like parts just don't change. And I wanted to double back really quickly and say how much I love Eden Robinson. She, like me, did realism for years. She wasn't shoved there, but I guess it was where Native American literature was at. And she and I both read like dorky literature as kids, and just being able to come back to all these speculative elements and then marry them to where you're coming from has been like such a beautiful thing. And, you know, the other writers I take inspiration from super quickly, there's just a ton of them. There's, you know, N.K. Jemisin, right, outside of, you know, Native American literature, but Brandon Hobson, right? I've already mentioned Tommy Orange, and so many women, especially in Canada, like I said, Katharina Vermette, Eden Robinson, Cher Dimling is just a killer. And then there's Kelly Jo Ford, Rebecca Roan-Horse, I've mentioned her, Annette Clapsaddle, who's a brilliant writer. And there's a woman named Brooke or B.L. Blanchard, and her book called The Peacekeeper, I think is about to come out in a year or so. And it's going to be another speculative novel by a person who's Anishinaabe, actually. And I could just tell it's going to be a killer. So anyway.
Well, I'm so glad you brought that up because I want to talk about women in Indigenous storytelling and also in community. And you know, just to get back to Waub real briefly, to me, a big theme of your book was that women were the ones who were bringing forward the Indigenous knowledge, the language, the culture, but keeping the community together in many ways. And Erika, there's a quote from your website that I'd love you to talk about in the context of what we just said there. That's what's funny about being an Indian woman. We don't need their respect, they need ours. I know that quote was pulled from I think an interview that you did, but you know, you've just given us a list of incredible Indigenous women writers there too. You know, expand a little bit more on that, the role of the women's voice in telling their own stories, but also in other Indigenous stories, that the female presence.
I think that you have these, you know, knockout writers that people pay attention to, right? Like Louise Erdrich. Eden, obviously, you know, has sort of like, has come back around, Sherry. And then you have, of course, why am I blanking her name? Ceremony. Leslie Mormon Silko, right? She's a classic. But I think lately it has been just a little bit of a boys' club, and Native women, for whatever reason, have kind of, as writers, been a little bit on the bottom. And I think that's a bit troubling, right? And I think it is hard for people of color in general to break into the big five. And it's especially hard for women of color because a lot of times people will be like, oh, we've done our due diligence. Great, check mark, bye-bye. And then there are people like Annette Clapsaddle, who is a phenomenal writer. Even as we breathe, I literally couldn't believe this book had not come, to me before. It's so good. It's about World War II. And these two characters kind of working in a hotel who are from this Native community that's kind of ignored traditionally. It's brilliant. So, but as far as like, I think traditional, I mean, obviously I want to reiterate, I'm very urban. And so I grew up around Navajos and Lakota and some Anishinaabe. And when I would hear them speak, I'd be like, is that Welsh? So I grew up in a very like, mixed environment, but the women in my family, even if they've taken some stuff from the dudes that maybe they shouldn't have, they were still extremely strong women. They stated their opinions. They talked about who they were, what they valued. They had careers that they loved, And I think one of the things I think a lot about is the fact that for white women, historically, they were property. Native American women obviously varies hugely from nation to nation, but they could own property. And I think this is why a lot of Native women are extra saucy these days, because they know we should be here. So they've got to really, kick it up a notch to get to just here. So.
Well, you have an incredible badass woman who is the protagonist in your upcoming book. A type of ghost story, horror story. I mean, it's about this protagonist, Kerry, who's on a quest to find out what happened to her mother. And she's sort of launched into these visions through a bracelet. It's almost like a portal. That's how the story unfolds, and how the mystery, I guess, or what she believed had happened to her mother versus what actually happened to her mother. Why is that something that type of like I said, it's like a ghost story almost, but there's some of the demons that she has to battle. There's I think something that's akin to a Sasquatch that you mentioned. I don't know the exact title of the character, but how much of that did you draw, say, from Indigenous storytelling or some of these characters that maybe you either grew up with or came to realize were part of Indigenous storytelling?
There are moments, it's funny, where I'm sure, because my grandmother went to a day school, which wasn't as destructive as the residential schools or the boarding schools, but it was still assimilatory, right? So my grandmother went in traditional, came out Catholic, right? But there are things that she gave to my mother that later I would hear other natives talking about, and I'd be like, that's the same thing. Like my mom would be like, if you go into the woods, there will be these little people or elves, and you can search for them. And I was like, ooh, and really it was just my mother getting me out of her hair. But later on, I'd be like, oh, and she'd be like, oh, my mother used to tell me those stories, right? So that's what survived. And I love those bits and pieces, because I think Native people, what happened is awful. And it's important we acknowledge genocide, cultural genocide, but I don't want to end up in that tragic narrative where we're always disappearing. That scares me. As to my book, I did take some inspiration. The Chickasaw have this creature called the Lofa, and it is sort of like an evil Bigfoot. It's hairy and it lives in a cave. Oh, it gives me the heebie-jeebies even thinking about it. And it pulls your skin off and eats it, and it's really scary. And so I used him as a sort of metaphor in some ways, but also something kind of literal, because whether it exists or not, it's terrifying. And it's just so, I love that stuff. I've always loved that stuff. I love portals. I love haunted mirrors. I'm obsessed with these things. When I was a kid, this was the literature that I consumed. Someone tried to give me a copy of To Kill a Mockingbird, and I was like, where are the dragons? This is just not acceptable. And so for me, everything to do with this novel where the main character is this sort of mean, but lovable, heavy metal, horror-loving person who just doesn't want to talk about her mother because in all honesty, it's too painful for her to touch, is forced to go on this journey to get to know her, right? And actually, I'm wearing my Megadeth t-shirt. You can't see it because I know Wob is also a metalhead. So that was, yeah, I figured that's right.
You mentioned there about cultural assimilation, and how much of those stories were lost, and this is a big part of your book, Wob, as well. I mentioned that character Aileen, who talks about, we've already had the apocalypse. They took our children, they took our language and our culture. Like that was the apocalypse. This is still an ongoing issue, obviously, in Canada as well. There's a reckoning right now about what's happening with the schools, and these schools still exist in different forms. So how much of those stories, those legends, those characters were lost, or how much survived with, as you said, Erika, your grandmother telling your mother and your mother telling you, where are we with some of those legends and stories that I see so much of that coming through in contemporary Indigenous fiction?
I think so much was lost, and I don't know if we'll ever fully grasp just what is gone, because we were split up, we were brutalized for generations, and as I mentioned, it's a long road back to where we need to be and where we want to be. And sadly, there are going to be some stories and some elements to our cultures that are gone forever, right? That said, though, I am always inspired by what we have now and the efforts of previous generations who essentially risked their lives to hold on to that knowledge, right? You have the little kids who would whisper to each other in their language behind the nuns' backs at residential schools to ensure that their language stayed alive and that they had those stories still, right? And then you had people who would have their traditional ceremonies in their basements or in the bush at midnight after the Indian agent was long gone. And here in Canada, the Indian agent was the authority figure who upheld the Indian Act, and the Indian Act forbade, ceremonial gatherings and so on, right? So these people risked, being arrested or even worse to keep these things going so that our generations would have them now, and that my children's generations and so on will have them in the future. So you can really go to dark places considering just how much is gone. Those stories, though, will live on in various capacities. I do think what's more important, though, is ensuring that we work hard to keep the languages alive, because there are elements to those stories and those cultural teachings that we probably won't fully comprehend in English or French or Spanish or whatever else, right? So I think we need to shift our focus to enshrining Indigenous languages in various parts of our societies and in our day-to-day practices. And I think more and more of those stories may emerge after that, right? It can only have a positive domino effect from there. So I think, to answer your question, a lot of the stories will still be there. I think it's time to start focusing more on the languages to ensure that we can take back what's been beaten out of us, essentially,
Well, you use quite a lot of the Anishinaabe language in your book. So what's your personal relationship to that? Did you grow up learning it, speaking it? How has that manifested itself for you?
Yeah, I grew up hearing it. I didn't grow up learning it properly to speak it. And that's due to the shame that was attached to it as a result of the Indian Act and residential schools and day schools. I am not directly descended from residential school survivors. However, our reserve was right beside a town. And, I think previous generations, like my grandparents and my parents and so on, were, led to believe that, to assimilate or to succeed, quote unquote, in that other realm, you had to give everything else up, So the language was still alive in my community, and we did learn it in our elementary school on the reserve, but only periodic learning, right? So it's not really possible to learn a language in a fluent way that way. Fortunately, the tide has turned back in sort of our favor culturally, in that communities are placing value on languages once again, because, we've been able to move away from, those oppressive Indian Act sort of measures. So, I'm trying, my goal is to be a fluent speaker. I am not at all right now. I've maybe the comprehension of like a 3-year-old at this point. But one of my brothers has since become a fluent speaker. Some other family members are working hard to do that as well. So I'm inspired by them. I do believe there needs to be more state support for that, because the state is responsible for trying to erase these languages. So I think even not just children, like adults, need the opportunity to reclaim their language, and they need to be financially supported to do that. And I could go on and on and on about that. I have some pretty firm beliefs about that, but I'll just leave that there.
It deserves its own session in and of itself. And we only have a couple of minutes left, but Erika, I'd love your thoughts on that and how to preserve these languages, particularly in an urban setting where you don't have, centralized, say, education of Indigenous people. Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, let me completely agree with Wob. There has to be money from federal and state agencies in order to make it happen. It just has to be, because people are just not going to do it otherwise, or if they're going to do it, they're only going to have some time and effort. I mean, it just has to happen. And it is valuable, and it is part of who we are. In fact, I would say there's come a point where I've understood, like, there are just things in the language that are irreplaceable, that sort of like, it's where our spirituality comes from. It's where everything, our values. So in any case, how I grew up was, like I said, with Navajo, and I grew up with Lakota and occasionally some Anishinaabe, a lot of Spanish, mainly English. It took me a while to realize those were different languages, right? In fact, to the point where when I was an adult, I'd hear those words and I was like, it actually took me a minute. And that's its own thing too. But, I also think about, I value that, and I love that, and you can see that in my work. But I also think about the fact that my great-grandmother, who raised my grandmother, spoke 3 native languages. She was Chickasaw. Her husband, one of her many husbands, was Apache. That's my line. And she spoke, apparently, she was this urban Indian in Houston, and she spoke all these languages. But they would say when my grandmother would come in the room, they would all stop. And she would throw away her regalia in front of her and say, what we are is gone. And I just think, I think that we have to be all like in a position where the Cherokee Nation is, right? So they're open enrollment. It doesn't matter the blood quantum. And as long as you have family traceable on these lines, which means that they're a huge nation. Their language was almost dead 20, 30 years ago. It's now neck and neck with Navajo, because what they did with that gigantic enrollment was just put it in every school. Were you white, but you were in their borders? You could learn Cherokee. Were you urban in Albuquerque or Denver? You could learn Cherokee. And so now their language is revitalizing.
Well, Erika and Wob, it's been so great to talk to you. Thank you so much for great conversation, but also incredible books that you have given. I see them as gifts to not just Indigenous folks, but other people who really want to and need to learn about all of this. And so it's just been a joy to talk to you and to read your work as well. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rice, Dr. Wurth, and Maeve for a riveting conversation exploring the complexities, nuances, and challenges of the Indigenous experience. Thank you all for watching and being a great audience. We encourage you to buy the books of our speakers that are available at the Boulder Bookstore. If you like the session, do consider supporting us through the Support GLF option button on the right-hand side of your screen. Your support is greatly appreciated. Once again, we would like to thank all our official partners. We hope you all enjoyed this conversation and will tune in tomorrow for the session Miss Burma and the Names for Light, Charmaine Craig and Thierry Mio-Cormint in conversation with Anandita Ghosh at 9 a.m. Mountain Time, 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, 10 a.m. Central Time, and 8 a.m. Pacific Time. Thank you once again.
Festival like this is a beautiful indication of the kind of thing that I truly, truly believe in, and I think makes our society more whole and more pure.
We do not take it for granted that Boulder was chosen as the first North American satellite festival. It's a huge honor we will not forget, and we are enriched because of it. We are indebted to both the local and international people that came together to make that happen, and we hope it's a tradition that continues for decades to come.
Literary festivals like this one build up an environment and an ecosystem to nurture readers and to promote the business of books. They provide an invaluable forum for writers to connect with other creative people.
We sit there peering into those electronic grids in front of our eyes, and it only increases the desire to see the real thing in the flesh, to actually hear an author speak firsthand, to read from their work, to hear the tones of their voice modulate as they read their most treasured passages of prose.
For us, it's special. This was our mothership, and it continues to be. The other editions that we have across the United States are smaller versions, different programming, but smaller versions.
In a sense, to me, religion and art are the same thing. They're vaguely irrational, but they help make sense of things. Someone who lives with no arts and no religion has very little to live on.
2019 was the 14th consecutive year of decline in global freedom.
You have to think of viruses as intelligent machines, as code crackers. And like all living forms, they have to adapt to their environment.
Imagination is a powerful tool. It doesn't matter which part of the world we are in our situation. Are we behind locked bars? Are we roaming freely? Independent thought and process. Our imagination allows us to soar out of any present circumstances that we find ourselves in. And that really is the power of literature and the written word. It allows us to envision a better future. It allows us to consider our past and make sense of the present. Imagination is a tool to be able to free us from the binds and the constrictions that we find ourselves locked into. We can break free. We can soar through the universe. We can rise up into the darkened night like a firefly, illuminating the world. This is what JLF Boulder, Colorado hopes to bring you, something to fire your imagination.